Welcome to part 3 of our 4-part webinar series on Windows 10. All of these series will be able to be found on our YouTube channel after the recording's done. I think part 1 and 2 are already up there. So if you haven't had a chance to go back and review parts 1 and 2, I would encourage it. It talks about Windows 10 from a couple of different aspects. So the session today is really around understanding and managing the technical components of Windows 10. So we're going to get a little more technical than we have been in the first couple of sessions. And while designing these sessions, it was clear that deep into the management and configuration of a lot of the new features, more time to go through it. So as we walk through the content today, we're going to provide you with a base layer of knowledge and some other elements as well to kind of take away from. We're going to go deeper in some areas where we think it's important to go deeper, but take a lot of notes on the areas of interest, and our contact info will be available at the end of the presentation. So as you have questions or areas you want to dive into deeper, please don't hesitate to reach out, right? So we're here to help. So let's go through what the agenda is. So for today's session, we're going to be exploring ways to customize Windows 10, both in a traditional build sense and in a modern management scenario. If you recall back to the first webinar that we did, we had this concept of a modern managed scenario, and we looked at how the infrastructure was managed in a traditional sense. And the builds will actually follow that pattern as well. So we'll go through that in the next couple slides. Then we'll take a look a little deeper into managing some of the new security features, Credential Guard, Device Guard, and we'll talk about Windows Hello for Business. We'll also review some common group policy settings, and we'll go through a summary and Q&A. So as you go through this, if you have questions, go and hold them until the end, and we'll get there. All right, so a little bit about Model to kind of set the stage of who we are. So we have 2 different divisions at Model. We have a consulting division, which is a team of experts that really go into an organization. They identify, they'll spec out, put a design together, build the infrastructure, and really enable you to operationalize the technology, whatever that means in your organization. It's a little different for everybody as we kind of go through relationships. From a technology expertise level, we play a lot in Azure. So components would be things like OMS, Azure IaaS, the EMS, Azure Active Directory, bursting virtual machines into Azure. And then on-premise, it's really all things System Center is really our core focus. On our managed services side, it's we look at it as an extension of your team for managing some of the day-to-day activities and things like System Center or PowerShell DSC. Ideally, taking some of these mundane tasks off your plate, such as image servicing or patch management, allows you to move the business forward as you know your business is much deeper at a much deeper level than we do, all while providing SLAs and reports around the services that we provide. Overall, we stay very much focused in our areas of expertise, and we specialize in building the right solution for your organization, right? So anyone can take a tool set and put it together, but making it a solution that works for your company is a core focus of ours. And we're a Microsoft Gold partner, Silver partner as well. So a little bit about me, some background. I won't spend too much time here, but I'm the managing partner of Model. I've been in IT for, this will be going on my 17th year. I've got a couple of children. One is 7.5 weeks old, so he's rather new, and a 5-year-old. I'm a CrossFit enthusiast, and then I don't ever talk about it though. And then 11 years ago, I was the technical editor of the Mastering System Center Configuration Manager 2007 R2 book, which is a huge mouthful to say, and it's hard to believe that it was 11 years ago. And then just last year, I was a contributor on the Microsoft white paper, the release pipeline model, which really focuses on how to operationalize DevOps development on Windows in your environment. And so with me today, I have a guest star that's also speaking with me. And so Nick Taylor. Nick, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hey, thanks, Jason. I'm a consultant here on the delivery team at Model. It's my 17th year in IT. It's hard to believe. Feels like forever. Good times. Let's see. It's my second year here with the Model team. I'm a father and husband as well. Baby number 2 is on the way, so I got about 6 months left before baby boy's here. Thank you, thank you. I will not sleep at all. I am not a CrossFit enthusiast. I am not a CrossFit enthusiast, although maybe I should be. And yeah, I think I'm a huge nerd, so that's always good. So it's fun. Wanted some fun with technology today.
Excellent. So Nick's going to help me out on a lot of the technical pieces as he's out delivering some of the Windows 10 projects that we've had here recently. So thought bringing some experience in from the field would be beneficial for our conversation today. So, all right, let's talk about customizing Windows 10. So if you recall back in our earlier webinars, and again, if you haven't watched them, they're on our YouTube channel, we identified a couple of ways to manage Windows 10, and the builds will follow suit. So in a traditional sense of modern management, or in a traditional management sense rather, you can see that most of the time, the devices are built on-prem and they're managed on-prem, and you have some type of remote access. So if you look at the diagram that's up on the screen now, you'll see that this probably is indicative of many people's environments. In this model, the idea of a customized image is still very real, right? So those steps would be rationalize what you put into your base image, determine what roles and software to install after the base WIM is complete. And it might be different for different locations, for different users. But most of the time, we find that IT still touches all of the builds, or a vendor will ship it directly with your image on it. In either sense, it's very much a highly customized image that you're working from. Some of the standards that go along with a standard build process, and this is our view of the world. So we have take your base image that we use MDT to build. It'll produce your WIM file that may include things like the .NET framework or C runtimes or additional applications, maybe Office, etc. And it all gets captured into a custom WIM, right? And then you have an image deployment scenario that we tend to leverage MDT with SCCM integration, that you take that custom WIM and you plug it into SCCM, and you layer applications that are stacked on top of what is your base build that you got from the MDT. And then you add in all of your dynamic settings. I truly mean dynamic, right? So your location, your hardware specific, your role specific, etc. And sometimes you need a wizard for the end user that's deploying the image to choose where it's going or who it's going to go to. But at the end of the day, the idea in a traditional sense is to build your image in a very dynamic scenario that doesn't have any kind of checklist after the fact, right? And so we want to automate all of the things, all of the processes that are encompassed with your image building should still be automated. Now, if we take a flip and look at the modern managed approach that we talked about in webinar 1, what you'll see here is the diagram looks a little different, but some similar components, right? So I'm going to explain this diagram through a scenario I found that's most helpful. So on the lower right-hand side, you have a mobile workforce. And so let's say that user has a Windows 10 professional or higher device. A user can walk through the setup of Windows that they buy from Best Buy or whatever, and do an Azure Active Directory join, assuming they have permissions, which can auto-enroll them into Intune and set your standard configurations, such as line of business applications, maybe what redirection to OneDrive for Business for files and folders. And then the device is managed just like it would be on-prem because it's managed through SCCM, as assuming you have the SCCM and Intune integration. Now, this modern approach may seem like a reach for some of us in our environments, but there's a significant number of benefits. And Microsoft is making it much easier in this scenario to actually be reality with technologies like Autopilot.
What's Autopilot?
Nick, I'm glad you asked. It's almost like I paid you to say that. Yeah. So Autopilot is it's a collection of technologies to pre-configure new devices. We're going to go through this as we get into it, but it's based out of the Windows Store for Business where you would manage it. And the device automatically recognizes that it belongs to the organization before it ever boots up and the user walks through it. Before we go to the demo of it, let's look at some benefits of it. So some benefits of configuration through Autopilot are automatically joining devices to Azure Active Directory. the auto enrollment of devices into an MDM, such as Intune. I'm sure you can use other MDM solutions that are integrated with Azure AD, but for our scenario, we're going to use Intune. You can restrict the administrator account creation. This is kind of a big one. So when you walk through the out-of-box experience on Windows 10, all the accounts are administrator by default. So if you have a choose your own or bring your own device scenario and they join it to Azure AD, they're an admin on their device. That may not necessarily be desired. You can configure that through Autopilot. You can create and assign devices to configuration groups and configure the profile. Now, this technology is still kind of emerging and coming out, so we'll walk through what it looks like today, and there's going to be additional features that will come through over time. But you can customize the out-of-box experience with content that's specific to the organization, which we'll look at today, and then you can ship directly from the hardware vendor to the end user, hopefully negating those multiple ship, multiple step scenarios. So a couple of the requirements, and then we're going to get into a demo. Devices must be registered to the organization. This means that the hardware manufacturer has to be involved, or you have to work with them to get the correct list of devices upon shipment, right? Devices have to be pre-installed with Windows 10 1703, which is creators or later. The device will need internet access. You must have Azure AD Premium P1 or P2, and then Microsoft Intune or some other kind of mobile device management scenario in play. Now, this is a great scenario when the company still buys devices and there's a lot of standards that you want to put in place, but maybe you don't touch every device, right? And everybody, it may not be a catch-all for everyone, but there's probably some form of use case in many companies of how this can work and advance kind of their infrastructure. So for a demo, because that's the purpose of the technical series here, is really to spend less time into the PowerPoint and spend more time demoing some of the technology. We're going to walk through the standard capture and deployment, some customizations for MDT through custom settings, INI, and the rules, the customizations to Win 10 that Nick's got set up for us, a BIOS to UEFI conversion in a task sequence, and then we'll go through an autopilot configuration as well, where we're going to produce the device list as our hardware manufacturer normally would. We'll upload it in the portal, and then we'll actually go through the provisioning process and see what that looks like. So let's jump into it. And so, Nick, I'm going to turn over the controls to let you drive.
Thank you, sir.
Make sure that everybody can see what we're looking at here. All right, so hopefully everyone can see the screen.
Thanks, Jason. So we're just going to jump into our standalone MDT environment over here and look at creating that base media and some of the custom things that we do inside here to make this a fully automated process. So I'm going to first jump into the workbench here, and you'll see we have one task sequence out here at the moment. Crack this guy open. And what we're trying to do with this task sequence is make it completely hands-off and completely automate it. Since this is going to be happening once a quarter for patching and probably once to twice a year with new builds of Windows 10, we want to try to automate this process as much as possible. So we can start it, walk away, and have a WIM that we could then import into SCCM for our OSD deployment. First, we'll take a look at custom settings here real quick. And check out some of the things we've baked in here to make this fully automated. So we're telling it the default task sequence to use, which is the one that we'll be focused on. We're skipping things like wizards and other options that we're setting inside of custom settings. We're getting down and we're telling it where to store the captures once it's finished baking in Windows. And we're also naming the WIM with the task sequence ID, today's date, and the month and year. So as much stuff as we could put inside of custom settings.ini to make this a zero-touch build process. So let's go ahead and take a look at the task sequence itself and a few customizations we've got built in here that we see on a fairly regular basis. So we've created a custom tasks folder to run, and all of these scripts we throw up inside of script root and the custom folder, and I'll show you an example of these PowerShell items here in a second. First, I'm going to go ahead and set my execution policy to unrestricted so I can run PowerShell and a bunch of the commands that we're running here. I'm going to apply a custom start menu. If you're not familiar with the process of customizing the start menu in Windows 10, we're going to take a box that we've already got provisioned, pin any items we want to around the desktop and the blades, and then we're going to run some export commandlets. It's going to generate some XML for us. We're going to take that XML file, move it over into MDT, and run some scripts to apply that XML so everyone's start menu looks the same out of the box. We're also going to use a script that Jason has developed in the past, just set some custom view settings for all of our folders, not hiding folders, showing file extensions, things as that. Set OEM information inside of systems so users can jump out, see what organization they belong to, see what phone numbers and email addresses are related to support. And then we're going to remove anything from Windows 10 that isn't a line of business app. And I'll walk you through that PowerShell script here real quick. Of course, you can add on tons of things in the custom tasks. You can set wallpapers, configure multiple desktop items, anything that you want baked into absolutely all of your corporate images. Take a quick look at that PowerShell. This is where we're removing anything that isn't a line of business app. Bing Finance, Bing News, Bing Weather, the Xbox app, the default Skype app since we're installing Office. Anything that we want pulled out of this base image, we're going to recurse through here and pull all those out of our system. So that's a lot of the customization we do. As we kick this off, it just spits out the WIM. From receiving the WIM, we're going to import that into SCCM. I'm going to quickly jump over into SCCM and show you the BIOS to UEFI conversion. As we run through the slide deck, you're going to notice that a lot of the prerequisites for the security features are going to rely on UEFI BIOS being enabled, UEFI being enabled, and also secure boot being enabled.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're, looks like people are having some problems connecting. So once this is done, it'll be posted to YouTube, and we will verify the quality of the video. If it's not, we will reschedule and do it again, but we're going to continue down the path. So hopefully not everyone is experiencing connection issues, but if you are, we will have the video posted, and if we need to do the webinar again, we certainly will. So go ahead, Nick.
Cool. Thanks, Jason. Okay, so this is our SCCM task sequence. So after we get out of MDT, build our WIM inside of Hyper-V, spit it out and import it into SCCM, this is part of our OSD. So I'm going to jump down into this Prepare for Conversions group. Under Prepare for Conversions, I'm setting an option on this group to look if UEFI BIOS is enabled. If UEFI BIOS is not enabled, I'm going to run through this group. First thing I'm going to do is restart in Windows PE. Then I'm going to partition some disks so I could drop the vendor-specific toolkits out on the local machine. So each vendor that I've messed with, Dell, HP, or Lenovo, all has specific vendor-related tools. The one that I've dealt with most recently is Lenovo, so that's the one I'm going to speak to. If you do have multiple vendors in play, you can create your folder structure similar to this and then add WMI queries inside of each group. As you can see here, I'm just doing a quick WMI query to make sure the manufacturer is Lenovo, and my steps would be similar to the rest of the manufacturers with their individual toolkits. Once I determine the machine type is Lenovo, I'm going to go ahead and copy their toolkits down to the local drive, and this lets me flip on UEFI. So I can enable UEFI through their set configure VBS script. Once I have UEFI enabled, I'll have the option to enable secure boot. Secure boot will be enabled at that point in time. And as you'll see through the rest of the prerequisites in the slides, we'll also need virtualization technology enabled on the local client machine as we're actually loading up a hypervisor, creating Windows 10 inside of a guest partition, and another guest partition for the operating system to call upon against our virtualized LSAS process and our list for related apps when we're running things like Device Guard. You'll see a little bit more of that as we move through the presentation. So as those items are set and enabled, we're then going to format the disk, jump and restart in Windows PE one more time, and then we're going to continue on to our install operating steps, system steps, just like we always do. The system is now enabled for UEFI for a Lenovo. It's going to format the rest of the partitions accordingly and run through the rest of our task sequences. That's a quick and dirty version right there. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email after the end. but Lenovo seemed to play pretty well with this. The other thing we might want to mention is what we've done for other clients is bake in BIOS or UEFI upgrades into this process as well, as some Lenovo's we've seen has issues with secure boots on certain BIOS versions. So as these machines are hitting the desk for reimaging, upgrades, or coming out of a box, maybe think about jumping in and updating their firmware inside of your SCCM task sequence as well. With that, I'm going to kick it back over to Jason here real quick.
Great. Thanks, Nick. So as we kind of mentioned earlier, that we can go extremely deep into the technology, but we want to make sure we give everybody kind of a base layer of knowledge about the different components. So that was kind of a traditional build sense of how to customize Windows 10. But what if you're going to go into the modern managed scenario, right? What if when you go into the modern managed scenario, you want to have devices configured the way that you want, but maybe you want to have end users walk through the config with it and the IT is not going to touch it, right? So let me pull up my notes here and I'll get started. So something called autopilot. And so autopilot, and hopefully you can see on the screen the PowerShell, but autopilot basically allows you to upload your hardware devices into the Windows Store for Business. And from that point, you can apply profiles to it. So here's the Windows Store for Business. And as you can see, I have one virtual machine and I've got a serial number, a product ID, and it uses a hardware hash. Now, the idea is that this information is going to come from your hardware vendor, but since I want to demo this today and I don't have a hardware vendor to provide me with a list that I can upload to the portal, Microsoft does provide a PowerShell way to get that list. And so I wanted to walk everybody through that today in case you wanted to go through it on your own. So the easy way to do it is to essentially run a couple of PowerShell commands. So we're going to save script get-windows autopilot info. We're going to give it a path. You do have to have a couple of things enabled in your PowerShell session for this to work. And then we're going to install the script, which is already installed in the system. And then we are going to run the get Windows autopilot info. And what you'll see is it collects a bunch of information from WMI to get a hardware hash. Now, if you want to put this to a file, you can put it to output file in demo1.csv. And then what we can do is jump over into our store for business and upload, and that's on my Surface Book. So we're going to go ahead and add it. We're going to do it real time here. So we're going to add some devices. And we go to demo1.csv, which was created right now, and give it a group, test group 2, just for the sake of our demo. And what you'll see here is it's going to add the device to our device list in the Windows Store for Business, and it allows us to provide policies or configuration on top of that. And so if I were to run the out-of-box experience again on this Surface Book, what would happen is it would be provisioned for whatever organization I'm associating with. If you'll notice, in this case, I'm associated with my demo environment in Azure. And so I have seen a bit of flakiness with the store. Sometimes it times out. So let me get logged back in here to make sure it's going to operate correctly. Okay, so we're on demo M, devices. Add the CSV, test group 3, oops, 3. And then we will refresh my list of machines and you should see a Surface Book show up. All right, so now I have a Surface Book in my autopilot devices area in the Store for Business. And here you can edit your profiles or create a new profile. So if I were to edit my profiles, I'm just gonna pick the demo profile. This is the one I'm gonna walk through today. Things on the out-of-box experience will happen, such as skipping Cortana. It'll skip the OneDrive and OEM registration process. It'll automatically set up for worker school because this is a worker school experience. It'll sign in with our company brand, skip privacy settings, and disable the local admin account creation on the device. So again, if you're looking at the modern managed scenario and you want a way to control some of the elements, this is the way you can do so and still have the users run through it. So I'm actually going to remove my Surface Book because that would be not good for my Surface Book. And then what we're going to do is walk through a registration. It's kind of like a cooking show on TV. So
Ooh.
yeah, so we already have a VM that is stood up. This is the hardware registration that I have put into my devices area in the store for business. So I just sysprep this machine. Here's exactly what the user will see in this scenario. So first you got to start with kind of a region, right? And so our region would be, let's see, is this region right? So I think it was selected on the United States, but I missed it and I started scrolling. There we go. And then is this the right keyboard layout? So this is the experience that you cannot skip. Keyboard layout is US. Do you want to add a second layout? We'll skip it. And then from here, what's going to happen is it's going to force us to agree to the license agreement, but now it's checking the for updates against 1703, which it won't find any in our case. And then it's going to check the autopilot service to see if it's a device that's already registered with an organization. So as the user gets a device, they unbox it. This would be their experience if you had the scenario set up. So what you'll see is, welcome to DemoEnv, right? And then I'll give my little DemoEnv logo here. It says, enter your DemoEnv email. Because the device is registered in autopilot, so I'll enter in my account. The reason why I'm using my admin account is this is the one that's licensed for Intune and to be able to join devices to Azure AD. It is not required that that is an administrator account, but you do have to have either all users enabled or a group of users that everybody's a member of, the ability to join devices to Azure AD for this to work. Okay, enter in my password. Let's see if I can do it without typos. Yeah. And now what's going to happen is it's going to provision my device, join it to Azure AD, and join it to our Intune subscription, right? So it now becomes enroll it rather into our Intune subscription. So now it becomes a managed device that you can do things with, such as push out software or manage just like you would in SCCM, assuming you have Intune and SCCM integrated, right? And so we're going to give this a few minutes, and remind me to come back to it, unless I can kind of hurry through here. But we'll check Azure AD, we'll check Intune to make sure the device comes up, but want to kind of keep the webinar moving for now, but we will come back to this. No smoke and mirrors, right? So, all right. Let me make sure I had everything covered on the autopilot components. Okay. So we're going to wait for that to come back, and we're going to jump back into the PowerPoint and kind of continue down the path that we were on. Let's see here. All right, so again, we talked about the custom settings INI as it pertains to the MDT, some light customizations to Windows 10, the BIOS to UEFI switch in the task sequence. We talked about producing the device list for autopilot. There's some other documentation out there on the internet if you're interested. And then we talked about the portal overview for the Windows Store for Business, as well as going through the actual provisioning process. All right. So on to the next topic that we want to cover is security features. So there's a plethora of new security features in Windows 10. So we're going to hit on probably some of the top prospects here, and then we'll go through some demos of those pieces to it. All right. So Credential Guard, Device Guard, and Windows Hello for Business are the elements that we're going to talk about in this section of the webinar. If you are unfamiliar with those, we're going to give a light overview. If you want a more in-depth overview, you can look at Webinar 1 or Webinar 2. They have a little more information out there. All right, so Nick, you want to talk about Credential Guard?
Yes, sir. So like we were talking to you earlier, you'll see that UEFI with Secure Boot enabled is going to be one of these prerequisites. Why we wanted to cover that in that task sequence flip earlier. You're also going to need virtual secure mode enabled. And just keep in mind that the largest change to your client-side devices when enabling these is the hypervisor is going to load first and load Windows 10 as a guest OS with other guest partitions available to call things like the LSAS process, or the secured list for what apps can run. So we hardened the endpoint a little bit more here. TPM is recommended, but it can be done via software, but Microsoft still recommends having a physical TPM chip. And there are going to be some additional components like Active Directory certificate services involved for Windows Hello for Business and Device Guard. But if we flip on into a couple more caveats of the new security features, again, UEFI, secure boot, support for virtualization technology on your endpoints, and keep in mind to look at those BIOS slash UEFI versions. We have seen a couple issues with a couple manufacturers needing updates to properly take advantage of these features. So just take a look at the engineering notes and make sure there's no issues with the current versions you're running. Another thing we've seen is keeping things like Device Guard in tightly controlled pilot groups. Since it is a newer feature, some of the documentation is a little lacking, and unwinding some of this can prove difficult. Jason will talk to that in a couple slides here down the road. And Windows Hello for Business, there's two versions of it. One relies on PKI. The other is total key-based, based on your TPM. There's not a lot of documentation out there for the key-based rollout. It does require less infrastructure. So as soon as that's out there, I'd like to get it in lab. If anybody wants to see that in a future blog post or has any questions about key-based, shoot me an email. And as I get that deployed in lab via key-based, I'll follow up with you. So Credential Guard, main purposes, we're going to isolate and harden the system. We're going to virtualize that LSAS process. If you're not familiar with LSAS, that's where things like hashes are stored for passwords. So you can run some PowerShell against a client-side device, fish those hashes out there, and begin things like replay attacks against domain controllers. So enabling Credential Guard is going to stop those type of replay attacks from gathering those hashes from our endpoint clients.
So Device Guard, alongside Credential Guard, one of the new features is Device Guard. And so it's referred to as Windows Defender Device Guard, and it's really a combination of hardware and software security features that when you put them together, they lock a device down so that it can only run trusted applications that you define in what's called your code integrity policies, right? And so this is it's much bigger than a whitelist of applications. And as Nick said, when you're thinking of piloting Device Guard, be sure to use tightly controlled pilot groups for that. And so ways to manage Device Guard, first and foremost is group policy. That is the most robust way, and it's a very simple set of policies, but can do some pretty damaging things in an environment. And then an SCCM, and I put a little asterisk there because it's a pre-release feature. So while you can have your SCCM environment on 1706 and you can manage Device Guard policies, it is still pre-release. It is not ready for production. And so you can deploy Device Guard policies in two modes, enforcement and audit only. And you can use the configurable code integrity and leverage App Blocker to identify the managed installers. But you cannot deploy signed binary policy, which means that's only in GPO. And basically what that boils down to is, do local admins have the ability from running untrusted software? If you use signed binary policy, they do not. If you use configurable code integrity, they can still run untrusted software themselves. And so Intune will have the feature down the road. It is not there today to manage Device Guard. And then PowerShell. PowerShell has a significant, or I guess a couple commandlets around it. The problem with it, it is still very difficult to undo. And so again, if I haven't painted the picture, removing and undoing Device Guard is intentionally difficult. Microsoft put it that way on purpose. In fact, if you go read the documentation, I believe that I lifted verbatim is intentionally difficult to undo, right? And so an automated successful removal involves new group policies, administrative PowerShell access to the devices. The device must be online and accessible, and some additional registry keys that you're not going to necessarily push through group policy unless you use some custom extensions. So again, I just want to throw a word of caution that when you're piloting it, if you're looking to lock down your environment, I'm on board with Device Guard. I think it's a great technology. Some of the management may not be there quite yet today, but it's coming very quickly, and it's coming to SCCM would be the spot to look for it. But just use caution, use limited groups to deploy it to.
Cool. Next component would be Windows Hello for Business. This is one of my personal favorites. It's one of Microsoft pushes to start moving away from passwords for an end user, move toward biometrics or PINs. Updates for this is coming pretty constantly with Windows rollouts. A lot of the new feature set does rely on the 1703 build. There is 2 modes to deploy this, kind of like I touched on earlier. You're either going to need a fully in place PKI using Active Directory Certificate Services or some other flavor of PKI, or you're going to be using key mode, which creates your key pairs using your device's TPM chip. There is a fairly good amount of infrastructure involved in this. If you're going down the PKI route, you're going to need ADCS like we spoke about, NDES for the deployment of those certificates. From a domain controller standpoint, you're going to need some 2016 domain controllers at each logon site. You're going to need to do a schema upgrade to get those new fields available. But other than that, no other changes to Active Directory. You don't need to upgrade your forest or functional level, just update the schema version as you jump into Server 2016. As with 1703 shipping, Microsoft did deploy a full on-premise solution for this. It does require PKI, ADFS on-premise. The hybrid solution is going to require federation with Microsoft into O365, Azure AD, Azure AD Connect, and Active Directory Certificate Services. For the PKI mode, even if you're in key mode, you will still need some certificates, as each one of your domain controllers will need to have new Kerberos tickets generated on them for these features to work properly.
All right, so we're going to go through, and we're getting low on time, so we're going to kind of make sure that we touch on these pieces so you can see where they're enabled and how to manage them, how to undo them potentially. So we're going to look at Credential Guard and Device Guard for Windows Hello for Business. Given the size of the infrastructure and the time that we actually have for the demo, it didn't make sense to try to put it into this component, this portion. So before we go on, let's check to see if our device is done, and it is. And so I want to check a couple of things real quick, and then we'll go back into the Device Guard, Credential Guard demo. So notice that it belongs to the organization DemoM, and the desktop name is UDA-HO 7B. So let's go take a gander, see if that exists. And so if I go to my Azure Active Directory, we'll take a look at devices or devices. And so here is at 10:27 a.m. on the 12th, Azure AD joined device. And so we can take a look at some of the information on the device. Notice if we had BitLocker enabled, we'd see some BitLocker items here. We can go into the Intune console and take a look as we have Intune integrated, and take a look at our devices and see if we have, see if that guy's a member. And he is. Here's our device that we were just working with. Last check-in time was today at 10:28. And we can see some information about some of the hardware information. It's a virtual machine, how much free space, etc. So as you can see, using Autopilot got the machine into your organization's management infrastructure, right? So before we go, let's take a turn and go back to Device Guard and Credential Guard. So when we talk Device Guard and Credential Guard, pull my notes. The first thing to notice is there's a lot of stuff going on in Device Guard, a lot of different areas to check. One of the things I want to make sure everybody was aware of is that you can do a get command module name, and it's config CI. So it's configuration of the code integrity is some of the commandlets that you can do to look at the signing policies to enable. One of the things that you'll notice is that there's a remove CI policy signing rule. I don't believe that it actually does anything. It's deprecated at this point. And so when you're trying to undo code integrity signing and code policy checks, that does not prove to be very helpful. Okay. If you want to check to see, I think it works here. If you want to check to see if Device Guard is enabled, you can go to MSInfo 32. You can pull up your system summary, and you should see Device Guard based security is not enabled. And this is on my Surface Book. So it's a very quick and dirty way to check it out. Another thing to notice on a machine that has device guard is to go to the code integrity folder under system 32. This is where the, I think it's P7B files are stored. That contains your code integrity policy. That is a challenge to remove from a device if you need to undo the device guard. If you have access to the machine and you're an administrator, you're able to remove that policy after you've not enforced that code integrity checks occur. So on to how do we turn it on? Enough about how to turn it off, right? Let's go take a look at group policy.
So yeah, as you can see, there's really two policy objects that wrap around enabling this feature. We could deploy our code integrity policy if we're looking at device guard. Really, we're just enabling this feature and pointing it toward the policy path file, which will be pulled down to the local machine, which Jason just explained. So we're enabling this and pointing to the code integrity policy file. I mean, a lot of the front end work is going to be whitelisting your apps,
right,
modules, all those pieces. Hopefully SCCM and the future integrations make that a bit easier.
So as you're thinking about designing your code policy files, you may not necessarily want to lump everything into a single code integrity policy file. And the naming of those, I don't believe that the naming actually matters. So you want to name them intuitively to either a role or how you're designing your P7B files, because some people may get certain elements, other people might not, right? So kind of think of it on an enterprise scale of how you would manage that kind of ongoing. And so the code integrity policy file path is defined here in group policy.
That's a great point, Jason. So the other piece of this is turning on virtualization-based security. We're going to need this enabled. And if we're enabling Credential Guard, we're just going to turn on virtualization-based security, and we are going to set this to enabled with UFI lock. At this point in time, our device is going to get our new policy. As long as our prereqs are set inside of our client-based device, we're going to boot Windows into our separate partition, and we're going to start seeing LSAS and a new virtualized LSAS process. So as you turn this on, you're going to notice LSAS still exists and a new virtualized LSAS process is there. Microsoft claims it's completely backward compatible, and we've had a lot of luck with it so far. But it's really just one registry setting and you're good to go, or one GPO setting, I'm sorry.
All right, so the other thing that you can do with Device Guard is you can manage it through the new version of SCCM. That's not SCCM, that's the main controller. Here we go. All right, so if you're on 1706, you'll notice that you have a pre-release feature called Device Guard, and if you've accepted pre-release features in your ConfigMan environment, you are able to go enable the Device Guard management. And what that looks like from an actual execution is under endpoint protection, Device Guard policies, you can set up as many policies as you want and deploy them. We'll just look at my audit only policy that I do not have deployed. And so I have audit only, and you can have inclusions. And so the inclusions section here allows you to overcome some of the issues with the managed installer behaviors, or it allows you to do things like trust a line of business applications that you cannot deploy with ConfigMan, and trust applications that are included in an operating system deployment image that may not be in SCCM either. So the intention when this gets fully released is that anything deployed from ConfigMan is going to be enabled in Device Guard to allow it to run, which is basically your giant whitelist of how things get deployed. So no more installing software outside of SCCM. If you're managing, and I don't know that it's there today, again, it's a pre-release feature, so I would not use it in a production. But if you're looking to manage it, you can go to the CCM logs file, or folder rather, and there's a Device Guard handler log that you'll see in there that talks all about Device Guard. Don't forget that it does include an app locker policy to verify the installers. So the app locker policy, if you're having trouble getting things kind of hammered out, go look at app locker and make sure that it's got the default rules. I've seen where you've configured it through SCCM, the default rules do not show up for whatever reason, which means nothing much runs on your machine at all. So, all right, so we are running low on time. So I do want to get to just a couple other pieces here, and then we'll finish up. So if you can bear with us. All right, so the common group policy settings, I'll let Nick kind of touch to these since you've actually been through the configuration.
Yeah, you bet. So these are ones that we run into across a multitude of customers here. We want to make sure we're delaying Windows updates. We want to limit the user's ability to opt into things like insider preview builds. And we want to disable their ability to look at things like pre-release feature installs via GPO. Another big one that we see commonly in the field is disabling OneDrive for cloud storage. It's a great feature. You just might not be ready for it yet. A lot of our customers aren't ready to make that leap or don't have controls around DLP in the organization to stop data from possibly leaking online and deal with things like retention periods. So we find ourselves disabling that on a fairly regular basis. We also, more often than not, turn off Windows Spotlight features, which add things to the sleep screen, like all the Bing search tips, all those items. Same thing with the Microsoft consumer features as we're in the enterprise. We end up disabling a lot of those. And certain clients don't want to use the web search or display web results when Cortana is involved. We find ourselves disabling that fairly often as well, or just disabling Cortana completely there. Those are probably the top ones that we hit on client sides, I'd imagine.
Awesome. Thanks. So, Nick, you want to take us to the roadmap of kind of an evolution of when you go through a Windows 10 project?
Yeah, you bet. So what we usually start off is creating a Win 10 customized image out of MDT, like we showed you earlier, automating that as much as we possibly can to get hopefully a zero-touch implementation of that as we're doing it once a quarter. Next, we want to take that WIM, bolt it into SCCM, and again, create some type of dynamic input or very light touch OSD process for the technician that's at the desk, dropping the machine in the correct OU, putting it in the right sites, layering on the right software for the organizational role, very light touch up front, and then enabling things like secure boot, firmware updates, anything to get us to that UEFI transition point to get us ready for those Windows 10 security features. If you're not using BitLocker in your environment, and we didn't cover it in today's demo at all, but it's a good point to bring this up. At this point in time, you're seeing a lot of machines come back on the bench for reimage or a lot of new machines being unboxed for Windows 10. If you're not using BitLocker and you'd like to use BitLocker, it's probably a good time to look into it. If you're using another vendor and want to make a shift away from them, now's probably another time to give BitLocker a good look. Then, since the deployment of Credential Guard is so easy, just enabling that one GPO policy and setting the one item underneath it, Credential Guard's right there. You're going to stop phishing attacks from your local machine, stopping those patch the hash types of attacks and hardening that endpoint device. Again, it's a newer feature. We recommend highly controlling your pilot groups. We've seen no issues with Credential Guard yet, but it's always good to pilot.
Always good to pilot because it does use a virtual transition from LSAS to virtual LSAS.
Exactly.
So make sure your applications can use that when they're accessing the hash. I haven't seen any issues with it, but that doesn't mean they don't exist.
Exactly. And they do leave the stub LSAS process on there, which actually calls the virtualized LSAS process.
So theoretically,
it is completely backward compatible, but pilot.
Pilot. Hey, just want to know we should pilot these.
Oh, cool. Yeah, pilot. Controlled pilots. And then start looking at Windows Hello for Business. I think that's the next layer on for security. I mean, really getting into using gestures, biometrics, or simple pins to harden your devices and stop things like replay and phishing attacks or wire-based sniffing attacks to start getting those hashes. It might be a little farther out, maybe 3 to 6 months as documentation increases and we get to start seeing the differentiators between key-based and PKI-based implementations of Windows Hello for Business. But if you have questions, we're going to be labbing all this out. It might take us a little bit to get there, but please let us know and we'll get back to you. And then finally, Device Guard. It's going to take you a while to create those lists for whitelist items, and hopefully SCCM and its future release components starts integrating more of that and makes our lives easier creating those policies. So we'd imagine that being the last implementation on that roadmap.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe for certain PCs it could go first, but for the general, they should go last. So
yeah, for sure.
So some next steps, just keep in mind that you're on a limited timetable to operationalize Windows 10 due to the KB Lake chipset that's coming, right? There's a lot of information to sift through and how it fits in your organization. Knowing that there's a lot to do, Microsoft has let us know that they might be able to help offset some of the implementation costs of Windows 10 through some of the funding programs through partners like Model. So reach out to me directly if you're interested in learning more to see if you can qualify for those kinds of things, or if you have planning service days you want to leverage to bring some of the consultants in to kind of help fast track some of the learning that you're going to have to do. At this point, we're going to open it up for questions. I realize we're running a little late. We tried to hurry, but we're chatty. So at this point, are there any questions? We'll give just about 2 minutes to type your questions. If our org goes to a VDI system, do these apply, or does the VDI have its own separate deployment setup? So like it depends, right? So it depends on how you actually deploy your VDI. So there's again, in imaging, generally speaking, there's not really a best practice. It's all based on what your organization does, right? And what you need to do. So I've seen some VDI organizations leverage virtualization technology on top of VDI to create things called layers. And in this case, none of this would be applicable to that organization. In a traditional sense of VDI and how you're doing your thin image or thick image, it might apply is about the best answer that I can give you without knowing more specifics. I realize that that's a horrible consulting answer, but that's about the best that I got. In the MDT custom task, you mentioned exporting the XML from a built machine. Is that better than using copy profile? So copy profile might still need to be leveraged in some instances for sure, but keep in mind that that's on the deployment. In Windows 10, it's not on the base build anymore. So I believe that copy profile, certain elements of it apply on the build of the machine, not necessarily the capture like the old XP days or 7 days. Could you touch a bit more on removing Apex packages prior to deployment? Nick, do you want to touch about how you actually remove those applications?
Yeah, sure. So just a simple PowerShell script that's in our MDT build. We'll pull that back up here real quick. So it's the remove apps one right there.
This one?
Yep, that's the guy. Cool. So yeah, we just create a variable called app lists and fill it in with all of the apps that we don't want, which there's a PowerShell commandlet to get all the default apps in Windows as well, which is how I generated this string of applications. And then we just go through and start removing the package.
Yeah, basically you loop through the list of that you provided and you give it the package full name and you remove Apex package. Good question. How are the feature updates reinstalling those? How about feature updates reinstalling those?
Once we remove them, like if you want them back in a deployment scenario on the floor?
Yeah, Josh, can you expand on that? In my research line, it appears that those are getting reinstalled in future release updates. You mean going from like let's say 15.11 to 16x 16.02 or going to 17.03? Yeah, excellent question. So a lot of the update rings and some of these pieces can be controlled through monitoring and managing drift. But I'd like to take that offline, and we have plenty of testing scenarios to see if we've seen that same experience. I don't know. Have you seen it out in the field yet?
I've not, but mostly when we've been going in, we've been dropping the new bits on there. So as we hit 17.03, they're gone. So
yeah,
by the time it circles back around for the next build,
yeah,
I'm usually gone personally.
Yeah. So Josh, I can comb our team to see if anybody's experienced that and how they get away from it. My initial reaction is to use either compliance settings or PowerShell DSC to have a gold build and do a make sure that you don't drift away from that. So if it sees that, run this PowerShell script to remove it. But let me take that offline. You bet. All right. So is there a resource online that shows your SCCM vendor tasks? I'm interested in how you updated the Dell specifically.
Yeah, actually, I found most of my info from combing other people's blogs and Microsoft articles. So yeah.
Did we put a blog out there on aggregating all of that, or?
I don't believe so, but I totally can.
Okay.
If you shoot me an email, I will forward you the blog post that I followed, and they definitely talk to Dells. I've just personally never done one in the field, but they talk about all the specific vendor pieces for the Dells. I'd be more than happy to shoot that over your way, sir.
I should probably throw up our contact info. I mean, I think most people have mine, but make sure everybody has Mr. Nick's. Before I move on, you bet. Before I move on, so the how to manage Windows as a service will take the entirety of the webinar for part 4. And so you notice we didn't cover anything about that today, which is probably a good spot where Josh, your question would fall into. But the topic will take some time. And so that is the next topic that we're going to cover. And we'll release a date for that here coming soon. If you need to get in touch with us between now and then, you can find some general info on our website. There's my email address. There's Nick's email address. I appreciate everyone's time. Sorry for running over, and let us know if we can help in any way.
Thanks all.
Thanks.